Good afternoon, and welcome to NSF's Improving Undergraduate STEM Education, Education and Human Resources Program webinar. This webinar is going to focus on the overview of the program with a specific focus on Level 1 and capacity building submissions. And this webinar relates to NSF Program Solicitation NSF 19-601. My name is Ellen Carpenter, and I'm a Program Officer at the National Science Foundation, and I'm one of the leads for the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education Program.
And I'm Andrea Nixon, also a Program Director and a co-lead with the IUSE program with Ellen.
Today's session is being recorded, and by participating in the session, you are giving us your implicit permission to record your questions and your comments. So anything that you type into the question box will be recorded, and we can either answer them on the as part of this webinar or by communication with you at some later point in time. I'd like you to think a little bit about what you would like to do and how you think you might be interested in working with improving STEM education. Are you interested in improving students' performances and retention in STEM courses and majors? Are you interested in increasing participation of women and students from underrepresented groups in your STEM courses, majors, or at your institution? Are you interested in preparing students to enter the STEM workforce? Or are you interested in increasing faculty engagement with their STEM teaching? And would you like to make your institution a better place for STEM teaching and learning? Well, hopefully you're in the right place. We'd like you to stay tuned to learn a little bit more about the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education Program and how you might be able to achieve some of these goals through applying for an award through this particular program. We're going to try to do many things today in the next 90 minutes. We'll provide you with an introduction to the IUSE EHR program, or the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education Program. We'll give you a small opportunity to brainstorm a little bit about what you might like to do and how you might like to generate a project and think about it in the context both of this webinar and in the context of a potential proposal to the National Science Foundation. We'll talk to you a little bit about program organization, and that will include a description of the different tracks and levels that are available to people who are interested in applying to the program. And we'll also talk a little bit about workshop and conference submissions, which are another aspect to our program. We'll give you some idea what we expect from proposals that are submitted to the program and how we expect them to do things like improve our understanding of STEM teaching and learning. We will talk a little bit about the review criteria that will be used to examine the proposals that are submitted to us. And NSF in particular uses two review criteria. These are intellectual merit and broader impact. We'll provide you with a list of resources that you might be able to use as you're preparing your application and thinking about your projects. And we have a special section at the end for those folks who are new to the NSF world, in which we will discuss a little bit about what goes actually into preparing a proposal, what the components are, and how you can try to meet the objectives of the program through preparing your proposal. During the course of the session, we will have several chances for you to ask questions. You will be asking the questions using the question box that's part of the interface window that you're using for the webinar itself. We'll ask you to type in the questions. If past history serves as present, we will get a lot more questions than we are able to answer. Andrea and I will do our best to answer some of the questions through live conversation as part of this webinar. If we don't get to your question and you still have a need to have that question answered at the end of the webinar, you are certainly welcome to contact us by email, and our contact information is on the front slide of the webinar slides. I should also mention that you have access to a number of resources through this webinar interface. The resources include a copy of the program solicitation, NSF 19-601, a copy of the IUSE webpage, or a link to that webpage that provides, among other things, contact information for program officers associated with the program. There is a link to find previously funded awards through this program, so you can see the type of things that are being funded through our program. In addition, we have archives of previous webinars. So this is actually the third webinar that we've offered in the particular series relating to this program solicitation. We had 2 prior ones early in December, and you might be interested in going through those as well. The resource section also includes an event survey and a copy of the slides that we are broadcasting as part of this webinar.
At a later date, today's webinar will be available on the AAAS site that's associated with this, that you accessed information about this webinar on.
That's right. So you'll have the chance to come and hear us all over again if you'd like to do so.
There you go.
So the first thing we'd like to do is to provide a brief overview and introduction to the IUSE EHR program. The program itself hopes to do a couple of things. We really would like to improve the quality and effectiveness of the education of undergraduates in all STEM fields, and we would also like to improve undergraduate STEM teaching and learning for all students, not necessarily specifically STEM majors, and or the institutional environment where these activities occur. The IUSE program will accept proposals from all types of United States-based institutions of higher education, as well as from professional societies and organizations that work with or represent those institutions. The critical word here, and it's actually in the title of the program, is undergraduate. So proposals that are submitted to the IUSE program should focus specifically on undergraduate students, those who are enrolled in accredited degree-granting institutions, either of the 2-year or 4-year flavor. And again, undergraduate students is a critical element of IUSE proposals. In the past, we've got a very long track record of funding a number of different types of institutions. So this graphic just breaks out a little bit the types of institutions that we've funded over about the past 10 years. The majority of our funding goes to public institutions, state colleges, land-grant universities, large public research universities, all kinds of things like that, with a substantial fragment of our money also going to private universities, to nonprofits, and to business or industry proposals. The largest fraction of the institutions are those that would grant doctoral degrees in addition to bachelor's and master's degrees. We also grant funds to institutions that stop at the level of the master's degree, and to institutions that also only go up as far as the level of the bachelor's degree or associate's degree. And we also provide some funding to non-degree granting institutions. And that might include things like the professional societies and organizations that work with and are related to the education of undergraduate students. So we'd like you to think very briefly about what you might like to do with a proposal that you would submit to our particular program. And so we're going to give you just a minute or two here to brainstorm a few ideas. So we'd like you to think a little bit about what you've been longing to do to improve undergraduate STEM education. So I'd like you to think about and write down a couple of things that you might have been wanting to do to improve STEM teaching or learning. To look at those ideas and to try to figure out which one might be most compelling to you. Maybe to reflect on the compelling idea and try to figure out a couple of things that you might need to implement this plan. Would you need money? Would you need people? Would you need collaborators? How is this idea going to come from your brain to actually be enacted on your campus? And maybe to develop a very brief plan about how you might approach this particular thing that you would like to do. And you can then keep this plan in mind as a target for an IUSE proposal. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to go through this brainstorming exercise, and if it would help you, you are certainly welcome to use the chat box or the question box to briefly state your ideas. Go ahead and think for about another minute, remembering to write down your best ideas. Okay, we'll start wrapping up this section in about 10 more seconds. So finish up, get your ideas down. Now's a good time to think about them. Okay, so let's get on to program organization. So we're going to talk about the different tracks and the different levels that are available within the program. The program itself has two different tracks. They are engaged student learning and institutional and community transformation. And within each of those tracks, there are several levels available, which could reflect the scale and scope of the projects that you might be thinking about. The two program tracks are engaged student learning and institutional and community transformation. So the engaged student learning track really focuses on the development, testing, and use of teaching practices and curricular innovations to engage students and improve their learning, persistence, and retention in STEM. So this really is a track that's focused directly on the students. It can either be a direct interaction with the students, or it can be an indirect focus through something like faculty professional development that would still end up impacting student learning, persistence, and retention. The institutional and community transformation track is a track that's a little bit broad-based and broader scale, and it thinks more about the transformation of colleges and universities to help them implement and sustain highly effective STEM teaching and learning practices. Here's a very quick overview of the tracks and the levels, and we're going to go into this information in a little bit more detail in the next set of slides, but I just wanted you to have it in front of you before we get in. So engaged student learning thinks about things like increasing engagement and learning through new tools, resources, and models, and generating knowledge about student learning, what works, for whom, and in what environments. Whereas institutional and community transformation is interested in spreading and scaling up evidence-based practices using a theory of change to guide the work that happens in this track. And also in the process, generating knowledge about the organizational change process and what's needed in order to effect and sustain change across institutions and communities. Each of these tracks excuse me, has three major levels within it. Within engaged student learning, these are called levels 1, 2, and 3. We're going to specifically focus in this presentation on level 1. And the reason for that is we have an impending deadline. The next deadline for level 1 submissions will be February 4th, 2020. Level 1 proposals are for a dollar value of up to $300,000 for a term of up to 3 years. And we have level 1 proposals both within engaged student learning and within the institutional and community transformation track. Levels 2 and level 3 are slightly larger scale awards. The next deadlines for levels 2 and level 3 proposals, it will not be until December of 2020. So you've got a few months to think about those types of projects. Within the institutional and community transformation track, we have a new level, which is a capacity building level. And this one has a financial limit of $150,000 for single institutions or $300,000 for multiple institutions, with a term of award of up to 2 years. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what we think a capacity building proposal might look like a little bit later in the presentation. So engaged student learning is a track that's really designed to focus on improving student learning. And this can be both direct, through an emphasis directly on students, or indirectly, as I mentioned, through something like faculty professional development. Projects in this track can support development of improved instructional materials and/or methods of applying those materials with different types of student populations. and projects aim to engage students, improve learning, and increase retention in STEM. There are a number of different types of projects that one might envision that could fall very easily into the engaged student learning track. And these might include, a number of items on this list. Please don't think of this as a limiting list. This is just a set of ideas that might help you generate some ideas about things that you could find that would fit into this track. But our suggested range of approaches includes things like developing and implementing novel instructional materials and technologies, designing and assessing metrics that could measure STEM teaching or learning, either in specific disciplines or across different fields of study, or assessing student outcomes as a result of measures that are implemented through this program. Projects could focus on faculty learning through professional development, or on discipline-based or interdisciplinary educational research. Projects might re-envision or adapt learning environments for different populations of students or different types of campuses. And projects can also support co-curricular activities that increase student motivation and persistence in STEM. Other things that you might consider might be a synthesis or meta-analysis of prior work, and we would like very strongly to encourage collaborations between 2-year and 4-year institutions to help develop innovative pathways for transfer and student success. Students that can be addressed by projects in this track could be at either 2-year or 4-year institutions. They should be degree-granting accredited institutions. Students could be STEM majors, either declared or undeclared, and that might mean students who are just entering their course of study who have yet to declare a major, or those who have more advanced in their fields of study. Projects can also target students whose course of study requires solid skills and knowledge of STEM principles, of non-STEM majors seeking to fill general education requirements in STEM faculty members as they're implementing different types of changes within their classroom, and pre-service STEM teachers in undergraduate teacher preparation programs in hopes of helping to improve STEM education for future generations. Awards at this level are typically designed, actually I should mention, we're going to focus specifically on level 1 projects right now, which are the introductory level projects with a $300,000 limit and a 3-year term. Awards at this level are specifically designed to support early stage or exploratory research projects, and can also support projects that might propose adaptation of existing pedagogies and methods in a novel environment on a small scale. And we refer to this as conceptual replication. Types of proposals that might be appropriate would include those from a single institution involving 1 or more faculty members in a single discipline or across several disciplines, or perhaps partnerships across disciplines, institutions, or communities that are focused on a single unifying thematic approach or problem. Pilot data could certainly be helpful in putting together a proposal at this particular level, but it's also not required. So projects with a strong grounding in the relevant literature would also be appropriate for submission to this level. I would like to draw your attention to one new piece of information that we've just released from the National Science Foundation. And this is a Dear Colleague letter that is trying very hard to encourage folks who have never received funding from the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education Program to think about submitting proposals to the Engaged Student Learning track at the Level 1 level. The contents of the Dear Colleague letter can be found at the URL that's listed at the top of the slide. And as I mentioned, this Dear Colleague letter encourages the submission of proposals from institutions that have not had prior IUSE EHR funding. These types of projects can do things like contribute to developing the STEM and STEM-related workforce, to advancing a disciplinary STEM field, broadening participation in STEM, educating a STEM-literate public, improving STEM K-12 education through undergraduate pre-service teacher preparation, encouraging lifelong learning, or building STEM capacity into higher education. As with all projects submitted to the National Science Foundation, Projects submitted to this track are expected to increase knowledge about effective STEM education through posing and answering knowledge-generating questions. If you intend to respond to this Dear Colleague letter, we would appreciate it if you would begin your proposal title with the words New to IUSE EHR DCL. This will allow us to actually aggregate these projects as a unit and to assess them in relation to each other.
The Institutional and Community Transformation track focuses on improving evidence-based instruction by academic departments, institutions, and other organizations or communities. That is to say, it's looking at interventions, sometimes those that are developed through the Engaged Student Learning track, and scaling them up. They are larger scale, institutional, or in the sense of academic community, disciplinary communities, to scale things up in those contexts. It supports efforts to build and understand systemic change in undergraduate STEM education. That is to say that these projects may study change in and of themselves as a part of the larger project, and aims to use appropriate theories of change to transform institutions. It's critical for institutional and community transformation proposals to include a theory of change that's identified in the solicitation itself. And as Ellen noted earlier, there was a AAAS hosted webinar on November 13th, and that webinar is focused on institutional and community transformation, and I encourage you to take a look at that as well.
Yeah, it is archived on the AAAS website.
The range of approaches, including, but again, not limited to, this set of examples are intended just to be illustrative. Transformation of high enrollment classes to include evidence-based teaching practices. Developing teaching evaluation rubrics rooted in a research-based framework. Development of faculty communities to improve accessibility or sustainability of evidence-based practices. Identifying best practices to guide institutional transformation. Inclusion of non-tenure track faculty or instructors through policy or professional development. And identification of common elements across disciplines, programs, institutions, or systems that support students from underrepresented groups to be successful in STEM. Institutional and community transformation proposals should, as I mentioned earlier, include a theory of change, include research literature and theoretical perspectives concerning change. The purpose of this is to identify the dimensions of the project that will be important for you to take account and perhaps to measure as you're carrying out your project. This recognizes that STEM higher education is a complex system, and that these projects may require the inclusion of teams of faculty members, support from departmental chairs, college deans, or others within an institution's academic leadership or at a systems level, and support from provosts or presidents. As Ellen mentioned, we're focusing in on level 1 proposals, and as you'll see shortly, capacity building proposals for the institutional and community transformation, or ICT track. Awards at this level are intended for early stage exploratory projects or small to mid-scale projects that can build upon prior work. Pilot data may be helpful, but is not required. Projects with strong grounding in relevant literature are appropriate for this level. The capacity building proposals are something that's new in this solicitation, and I want to give you a little context for this. As we were preparing the new solicitation, we had a convening of PIs that have been funded within the IUSE program. And one of the topics that we covered was the importance of broadening the types and number of institutions that receive funding through the institutional and community transformation track. And that is the purpose, that conversation is where the capacity building proposal came out of. The purpose of this is to enable institutions that have not had a prior institutional and community transformation award to identify and develop a project of interest. Funding is intended to support efforts such as assessing institutional needs, formulating departmental and/or institutional commitments, developing necessary partnerships, audit prior institutional efforts, and by that we don't mean audit in the budgetary sense, but rather to identify prior institutional efforts, to gather data, learn about relevant theories of change, identify relevant institutional practices and policies, and formulate plans for advancing institutional or community transformation. At a very high level, I would differentiate a level 1 and a capacity building proposal by saying that a level 1 proposal is designed to articulate the contours of a project that you want to carry out. A capacity building proposal is one that is designed for you to identify a problem area, issues that you feel that you need to explore to address that area, and activities that will enable you to develop a full level 1 or level 2 institutional and community transformation proposal in the future. Proposers are encouraged to include a variety of participants, disciplinary or educational researchers, assessment and evaluation experts and advisors, institutional leaders. Funds are intended to defray costs for coordinating among project participants, gathering and sharing data, convening and hosting working meetings for participants, and attending relevant meetings such as our upcoming IUSE EHR Summit. Think about the work that you would want to cite, the theoretical literature. I encourage you to think about people that have expertise in that, and if you are having a gathering that you might propose as part of a capacity building proposal, think about inviting them. Thinking about staging the conversations that would be necessary to build the movement at your institution to put together a successful ICT proposal. Proposals may be submitted by a single institution or as a collaborative project from 2 or more institutions. The maximum award for a submission from a single institution is $150,000 for a maximum duration of 2 years. The maximum award for a collaborative project is $300,000 for a maximum term of 2 years. Circling back to the summary, you'll see that both with engaged student learning and institutional community transformation, the level 1 proposals have the same maximum budget and the same potential duration of up to 3 years. Again, capacity building proposals are up to $150,000 for a single institution or $300,000 for multiple institutions with a maximum duration of 2 years. The program deadlines for level 1 and capacity building proposals are identical. February 4th, so in a little less than a month, is our next deadline. And then again, August 4th, so in the first Tuesday thereafter in each of those months. The level 2 and level 3 proposals are in the first Tuesday in December in subsequent years. The IUSE program also supports workshops and conferences. It's a unusual feature, and I think a good feature of the IUSE program, that these workshop and conference proposals can be submitted at any time. Depending on the size and scale of the workshop and conference, these proposals typically include budgets between $20,000 and $100,000. Proposers must consult an NSF program officer before submitting a proposal for a workshop or conference, and this is intended to determine the appropriateness of the workshop for the IUSE program. You can see the program officer contact information and their disciplinary affinities at the program at the IUSE website, and that's also included in our solicitation. Conference and workshops the proposals addressing diversity in STEM teaching and learning, and those involving collaborations of educational researchers and disciplinary scientists to ensure that STEM teaching reflects cutting-edge STEM disciplinary research are especially encouraged. With that, we're going to pause and address some of the questions. You've already submitted some of them, and we'll just spend some time talking through them. One question is, do capacity building proposals require research questions? Capacity building proposals, as I mentioned earlier, are really designed to help you prepare for a full proposal. What you should identify in capacity building proposals are the topical area you will address, identifying people that need to be a part of that conversation, the kinds of activities that you will engage in, and a justification about why those activities will help you to develop a full proposal. In the context, as I mentioned earlier, of an institutional and community transformation track proposal, theories of change are important to address. With respect to capacity building proposal, you may not need to know exactly how you would implement or employ a theory of change, but it would be important to address in your capacity building proposal the mechanisms by which you will identify that, you will explore theories of change, and you will incorporate that kind of information into your full proposal.
Another question regarding capacity building projects is whether letters of collaboration or support are needed. When we talk about the multi-institutional capacity building projects, we actually intend those types of proposals to be full collaborative applications. That would mean a proposal that has come from multiple institutions, with each institution submitting its own component of the collaborative proposal. In that case, a letter of collaboration from the collaborating institution would not be necessary because they're considered a full partner on the project. If you're going to have a collaboration, say, between 2 or 3 institutions as part of the main project and then have additional institutions participating in the activities of the capacity building proposal as well, in that case, that might be appropriate to include letters of collaboration from the campuses indicating their willingness to collaborate with you as you build this particular project for submission to a future competition.
There was another question about, given the large fraction of funding that goes to advanced degree granting institutions, are we open to funding projects from community colleges? And the answer is absolutely yes. The capacity building and the DCL that the Dear Colleague letter that Ellen mentioned that's specific to an engaged student learning track are really about expanding the number and type of institutions that we support. So regardless of institutional type, we would encourage you, if you have a project in mind that's suited to the IUSE program, that you submit a proposal.
Another question addresses international four-year colleges for the projects. The lead institution certainly has to be a U.S.-based institution, and NSF's policy is not to send money directly to foreign institutions. If there's a collaboration that would be improved by collaborating with a four-year institution, I think that with an international institution, that would be appropriate, but the project has to be very carefully structured so that money is not flowing directly to that international institution, and so the benefit to U.S.-based students becomes apparent from the project itself.
There's a question about work coming from an economics department and supporting interdisciplinary work. Some of that question is very specific, and I would encourage you to contact me, this is Andrea, directly about it. But let me say in a more general sense that that there are perhaps a wider array of departments that are STEM, that are NSF supported. By that I mean political science, economics, sociology, for example. So I would encourage you to be in touch with me or another program officer if you have specific questions about the kind of support that's available to a particular discipline from the NSF.
There's a question about the Dear Colleague letter. The question is this new to IUSE DCL only for ESL track proposals, or are ICT proposals also included? We're specifically gearing the DCL toward engaged student learning proposals, level 1 proposals specifically, with the idea that we have a track within the ICT program, the capacity building track, that would bring in those individuals who are new to the ICT track.
There's a question about faculty professional development. Do you need to have student measures as a main part of your evaluation plan? I don't know that I would say categorically that you need that, to have student measures as the main part of your evaluation plan, but you will want to think carefully about how you will measure the efficacy of that particular initiative as it relates to undergraduate STEM education. And measuring student learning outcomes can be an important component of that.
Okay. General question, what is the page limit for capacity building proposals? They actually will be subject to the same page limit as all NSF proposals, which is 15 pages for the project description. The basic mechanics of putting together a proposal are described in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. And so all specific information about the different pieces of a proposal will be found in that document.
There is a question about what do you mean by undeclared STEM students? IUSE funding can be used to either support work that takes place in STEM departments that are focused on majors, but there's also an emphasis on preparing a STEM literate populace. So that is to say that STEM courses that are taken or STEM relevant courses that are taken by students who are not majoring in STEM fields are completely appropriate for support from the IUSE program.
Here's a question. If a project involves running a pilot study, would such a project be a better fit within capacity building or a level 1 grant in ICT? I think that would really depend on the study itself. If the pilot study involves gathering data for putting together a future proposal, then it might be best suited to the capacity building. Although if you're running a study using some measures that you have already worked out, then you might actually be ready for a level 1 project as opposed to running through the capacity building track. Another question is, can a conference and workshop proposal be submitted at the same time as an ICT proposal? The answer to that is yes. Principal investigators are limited to no more than 3 submissions within a year, and we actually define a year based on our fiscal year term, which would be October 1st through September 30th. So you can serve as a principal or co-principal investigator on no more than 3 IUSE proposals within that year term. Those proposals can be any combination. It can be an ICT, it can be an engaged student learning, it can be a capacity building, it can be any of the levels, but we will look across the program to make sure that no one exceeds that 3 proposal limit per investigator.
There are a couple of logistical questions that I wanted to address. One was the nature of the deadlines. Can we clarify the schedule again? Was the February 4th and the August 4th deadline for ICT and engaged student learning? Yes. So those two deadlines are for level 1 in capacity building proposals regardless of the track. There was a second logistical question that had to do with food, paying for food in budgets. That is the type of question that you might look up in our proposal and award, the Policy and Procedures Guide for Proposals and Awards, the PAPPG. In essence, if meals are included in a budget, they need to be working meals. And that the PAPPG is a great resource for that kind of logistical information.
Another question, does a capacity building proposal need an evaluation section? And the idea certainly is that every proposal that comes to the IUSE program, regardless of the level or track that it's coming through, does need some mechanism to evaluate the outcome of the project. And this may be as simple as validating that proposed workshops have taken place, that meetings of faculty have been convened as they were planned, as data was gathered, and that enough information was gathered to be able to consider putting together a proposal at a level 1 or a level 2 level within the ICT track. So an evaluation section is very important, although it may differ a little bit from the type of evaluation that you might plan for a more in-depth project.
There was a question about the phrase capacity building. This is a phrase that we use in a number of programs. As the questioner rightly identified in the EHR core research program, we also use that in the NOISE program. The capacity building in the specific question was contrasting our use in the IUSE program with the EHR core research program. Capacity building in the ECR program, or the core research program, is focused on helping people either at an individual level to focus in to have opportunities to further develop their methodological abilities, or their abilities with a wider array of research methodologies, or on an institutional level to stand up institutes that will enable people to study research methods that would enable people to engage in foundational research. So there's a parallel in the sense that capacity building proposals are intended to broaden the number of people in the field who are able to submit successful proposals for that particular program. The parallel here with the institutional and community transformation track of the IUSE program is that we're funding projects that are designed to make a greater number of institutions to position themselves to be able to successfully compete in the institutional and community transformation track.
We're ready to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to move back into our webinar slides, and we'll have another chance for some questions at a little bit later point within the webinar. We'd like to talk a little bit about program expectations. The IUSE EHR program has a number of very specific goals. And so these goals include things like building knowledge about STEM teaching and learning at the undergraduate level, about incorporating evidence-based practices in STEM teaching and learning for all undergraduates, and also to build and understand systemic change in undergraduate STEM education. So we're hoping that projects will do things like develop novel, creative, and transformative approaches to undergraduate STEM teaching and learning, to be able to adapt those approaches, including evidence-based practices, at different types of institutions and with different populations of students, and also to lay the groundwork to maintain these changes over the long term, whether this is at the departmental, institutional, or community level. All IUSE proposals are expected to increase knowledge about effective STEM education, and this can be achieved in a number of different ways. One possibility is through posing one or more research questions, such as educational research questions, or possibly through evaluation of project activities, impacts, or outcomes. The whole idea is to actually improve our understanding of what works in undergraduate STEM education. So the idea behind gaining this new knowledge is understanding what works. And to understand what works, you have to have some way of examining what you've done and whether it's been successful. So posing the research questions or performing a thorough evaluation and assessment of these project activities are ways in which you can achieve this objective. Successful IUSE proposals will build on what's known. And so it's very important that one read the literature and understand what's been done before in order to define a starting point from which one can extend the prior work. Projects should include a well-designed plan to gather data. So understanding the data that will be needed and how it will be gathered will be an important component. Projects should specify methods of analysis that can be employed to answer the questions that are posed within the project, and should include mechanisms to evaluate the success of the project. And this should include both formative and summative evaluation. Projects should explain how the findings and materials will be shared with the educational community at large, either across the institution or across the nation, and should also address the sustainability of project efforts. We'd like to see that these projects take on a life of their own. So the grant can be thought of as a way to get the project started, but the sustainability could be a measure of its success over the long term. Investigators and projects should also plan to collaborate with other investigators, institutions, or communities as needed in order to make the project a success.
The methods of analysis that you identify should align with the research or evaluation questions that you pose. It's important to select appropriate methods to perform the study and to analyze the data. some people assume, because we're the National Science Foundation, that there is an emphasis on quantitative data, and that's not accurate. What we look for is that the questions posed, whether they're research questions or evaluation questions, are addressing an important question, and the methods of analysis are such that they will enable you to answer those questions, whether those methods are qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods.
Okay, so we have a little quiz for you. Now is the time to check what you know about the IUSE program. So the answers to these will be true or false. The first fact, or the first question, all proposals must have a research component. The answer to this is false. However, all proposals must generate new knowledge, and so we've just talked about the expectations for knowledge generation over the past couple of slides. Second fact, STEM curriculum development, programmatic pathways, learning resources, assessment instruments, and faculty development may receive funding. What do you all think? True. Any one of these would be an appropriate avenue for developing a project and for receiving funding from the National Science Foundation. Proposals may focus on both STEM and non-STEM majors. Also true. We seek to improve undergraduate STEM education for all types of students, and that includes both majors and non-majors as appropriate to the project. Proposals may focus solely on students in a single discipline. This is also true, and perhaps particularly appropriate for level 1 types of proposals that tend to be a little bit more smaller scale, and it might be more appropriate to hold within a single discipline. However, there can also be an emphasis on multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary STEM education, and all of these foci are appropriate for the IUSE program. Next point, an evaluation plan that provides formative and summative assessment of the effectiveness of the project in achieving its goals is required. Also true. We expect an evaluation and assessment plan as part of every project so we can see how the project is progressing and make sure that you're achieving the goals that you've set out for yourself. Proposals should demonstrate a solid grounding in relevant literature on STEM teaching and learning. Also true. We really expect that proposals will develop a very strong literature base from which the work will begin in order to justify continued efforts in the field. Only colleges and universities may submit proposals. This is false. All categories of proposers that are listed in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide are eligible, and this includes things like professional societies, companies, nonprofit organizations, and others that are focused on undergraduate STEM education.
There was a question that was submitted specifically about whether institutions of higher education and disciplinary associations could work together. And the answer is yes on a proposal.
Absolutely.
You definitely could.
Okay, another quick fact check for you. So which of the following types of activities can receive IUSE funding? Using and building evidence about improved STEM instructional practices, investigating novel instructional tools or learning systems, creating, implementing, and testing program, curricular, course, and technology-driven models, developing, implementing, and testing creative approaches for adoption of education research into disciplinary teaching, developing and validating assessments or metrics for undergraduate STEM learning, propagating and sustaining transformative and effective STEM teaching and learning through institutional practices or involvement of professional societies. And the answer is all of the above. So every one of those is an interesting way and could be a possible avenue of exploration as you think about an IUSE project. We can take another break for some questions. If anybody's got a few, we'd be happy to answer them.
There's one question. We have a collaborative proposal between two institutions. In what ways can we effectively demonstrate a record of collaboration? If by that you're referring to the activities that would be in a proposal, the activities that you would like to have funded, it's important to have a plan in which you're identifying the elements of the proposal, the project elements, and to identify the roles. That can be enumerated both in the project narrative. We'll talk about that later. That's a 15-page, up to 15-page document. You can also identify roles and responsibilities in the section of the budget where you're articulating the kind of funding and support that you might want to have. So there are a couple of areas in which you might signal the nature of the collaborative efforts. A third way is through the structure of the proposal. That is more of an element that comes into play with level 2 and level 3 proposals, for example, in collaboratives, where that is at some level signaling the kind of decision-making processes and the ways that the project will unfold, and whether or not the award is given to multiple institutions or to a single institution that is in a singular way going to lead the effort.
Okay, one question comes from a community college. Can a new institution submit a level 2 or a level 3 proposal? And the answer is absolutely yes. The levels should be really determined on the scale and scope of the proposed project, and certainly not on whether one has had any prior IUSE funding, for example. It's not required that you complete a level 1 project before moving on to a level 2 or level 3. If you have a project that's appropriate for level 2 or level 3, by all means, please develop it and submit it to the appropriate level.
There is a question about whether or not it's okay to include both students and faculty at the same time in proposed activities. And the answer to that is yes. We've actually funded prior work that's looked at, for example, multi-generational teams that are involved in course design, course building, and evaluating the efficacy of courses. So the inclusion of both faculty and students could be a real asset, depending on the nature of your project.
Question about the PI and co-PI education. Do co-PIs need to have a terminal degree, for example, a doctorate, or must people with no doctorate be senior personnel? We have absolutely no requirements for degrees of either the PIs or the co-PIs. Anyone with appropriate experience and interest is welcome to serve as a co-PI or a PI on a project as appropriate.
There is a question about how strict is our definition of professional development. Does it mean building a network of faculty who teach the same subgroup of students in order to exchange instructional strategies, read and learn together? Or can it be more broad than that? And this is for the Engaged Student Learning track. We are not prescriptive in how you define professional development. I would encourage you that in the course of developing a proposal to clearly define what you mean by that for an audience of people who are not a part of your particular project, so that you're articulating the dimensions of the program in a way that's understandable to the reviewers. But we are not prescriptive about what we mean in terms of professional development.
Okay, here's a question. In a multi-institutional application, do all the participants participants required to have no prior IUSE funding for level 1? If you're answering the Dear Colleague letter, we would expect that the lead institution in a collaborative be the one that have no prior IUSE funding.
And that's true for capacity building as well.
That's true. It would be appropriate for the lead institution to be the one with no prior funding, but you can certainly partner with or collaborate with institutions that have had prior IUSE funding.
But the level 1 applications are open to anyone, any institution, regardless of if you've had prior support or not.
Right. It's only in responding to the Dear Colleague letter or within the capacity building track that prior support will matter.
There was a question that relates to, does funding require 60% of the participants' support costs? I think that the IUSE program in general is extremely flexible. So unlike, for example, some scholarship granting programs, the STEM program or the NOISE program, there are very specific guidelines in those other programs about how funds should be allocated by certain percentages. In contrast, the IUSE program is very flexible. We do not have requirements along those lines. It's just important for you to be very detailed and specific and make a compelling case about how you would marshal the funds that you would, or use the funds that you are requesting.
Capacity building proposals are expected to enable institutions that have not served as the lead institution on a prior ICT award to identify a project of interest. Is there a place we can check which institutes have served as the lead institution before or not? The first place to check would be with your own sponsored programs office. And another useful, interesting piece of information would be to go through the database of prior awards. And on the resources page, we have a link to the archive of previously funded awards through the IUSE program. So you can search those awards by institution. It's relatively simple just to type that into one of the boxes in the advanced search window in particular, and to be able to look and see whether that institution has received funding from the IUSE program in the past.
There's a question about Level 1 proposals in the Engaged Student Learning track. It seems, the question goes, it seems that the development of new tools may be appropriate. If so, must they be accompanied, oh, that question just went away in front of me. If the question was, do they need to be accompanied with external validation or other tools? Forgive me if I'm not getting the second part of your question exactly right. We encourage you, in cases where there are instruments that have already been validated, particularly for the environments in which you would be working, to go ahead and use those and not reinvent the wheel. That it is important, if you're developing tools, to think about how you might measure the efficacy of those tools. That was for the Engaged Student Learning Level 1.
Okay, here's a couple of questions about prior funding. One question is, if you've had a prior CCLI grant, which was a precursor to the IUSE program, is that considered previous IUSE funding? And under our definition, the answer is no. So if you've had a CCLI grant, that is certainly not, that will not eliminate you from competition as new to the IUSE program. Another question is whether funding through the STEM program would be appropriate for submitting an IUSE Level 1 grant. The STEM program and the IUSE program are actually totally distinct and separate from each other. So having a prior STEM award does not preclude you from submitting an IUSE proposal at any level. If you have a good idea and think it fits appropriately in Level 1, having an STEM grant or being a PI on an STEM grant should certainly not inhibit you from submitting your work to the IUSE program.
Another question, to what extent do we need to discuss possible theories of learning in a Level 1 IUSE grant? I would encourage you to be very explicit about the theories, the existing literature that you're building upon. And so theories of learning could be critical. If you're thinking about theories of change, that's specific to the ICT, the Institutional and Community Transformation track. But as we'll talk about in a minute, it's really important to situate your project, your proposed work, in the existing literature so you can make a strong case that your project has the potential to generate new knowledge and to contribute to our larger conversations.
Okay, here's a question about inclusion of K through 12 students. For Engaged Student Learning Level 1, is it possible to include K through 12 in the proposal? Is it desired or possible to create material that could benefit both the K through 12, grades 9 through 12 specifically, and undergraduate communities? This project would focus on advancing the 9 through 12 students and not specifically the 9 through 12 teachers. IUSE is a program for undergraduate students. So this is students that are enrolled at a 2-year or 4-year institution that presumably leads to an associate's or a bachelor's degree at the very minimum. If the project is primarily focused on those students and the materials could be readily transferred to K-12, there's no reason not to include that, although the focus really should be on the undergraduate students as they're enrolled at a 2-year or 4-year degree granting institution. Projects that focus too heavily on K through 12 students run the risk of being returned without review from the IUSE program.
There was a question about whether activities that relate to summer bridge programs could be included, and the answer is yes. So long as your focus is on the undergraduate STEM education, that is appropriate. That would assume, I think, that there's some sort of institution affiliation that's involved in that.
Okay, should we move on?
Sure.
Okay. The next part of the webinar is going to focus on the criteria that the National Science Foundation uses to review proposals that are submitted to its various programs. So the National Science Foundation has two merit review criteria. They are intellectual merit and broader impact. Intellectual merit is defined as the potential for the proposed activity to advance knowledge and understanding within its own field or across fields. So that you could sort of rephrase this as, what will we learn from the work? What are we actually going to learn? Whereas the broader impacts address the potential for benefiting society or advancing desired societal outcomes. And you can think of this sort of in the terms of, why is the work important to society? So intellectual merit can consist of a lot of different things, and we ask our reviewers to address a number of possible concerns when they review these proposals. Intellectual merit may consist of advancing knowledge and understanding within a particular field or across fields. It can also include things like the PI and the team's capability in conducting the project itself. Intellectual merit can address the access to necessary resources to complete the project, and can also address the plan for what the project will do, who will do it, when it will be done, and why. So having a well laid out and a carefully thought out plan of attack can be a very important component of intellectual merit. We also ask reviewers to consider whether there is a mechanism to assess the success of the proposed project attempts to advance knowledge. How are we going to know if this project works, basically? Broader impacts are the benefits to society, and these can include things like representing the participation of women, persons with disabilities, and underrepresented minorities in STEM. Things like improving undergraduate STEM education and educator development at any level, increasing public scientific literacy and public engagement of science and technology, and improving the well-being of individuals in society. Broader impacts can also include the development of a diverse, globally competitive STEM workforce, increased partnerships between academia, industry, and others, improve national security, increased economic competitiveness of the United States, and enhanced infrastructure for research and education. We ask our reviewers to consider a few other things in addition to these major review criteria, and that includes things like assessing whether the project includes creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts and activities, whether the plan for carrying out the activities is well-reasoned, well-organized, and based on a sound rationale, and whether the plan incorporates a mechanism to assess the success of the project. We ask reviewers to consider how qualified the individual, team, or institution is to conduct the proposed activities, and whether there are adequate resources available to the PI, either at their own institution or through collaborative efforts with other programs or institutions to carry out the proposed activities. There are a number of very specific things that reviewers are also asked to review, and these include things like the statements on facilities, equipment, and other resources, the data management plan, a postdoctoral researcher mentoring plan if postdocs are included in the project, and any required supplementary documents.
It can be a great way to get to know the IUSE program to serve as a reviewer.
True. So we have another little exercise for you. We're actually going to put up a few examples of things that we have pulled out of prior projects that would represent either intellectual merit or broader impacts. And we're going to ask for you to see if you can determine which of these fits whether the information that we're putting up actually fits the broader impacts or the intellectual merit review criteria. So this first one, in addition to development and implementation of a novel curriculum, the project will include educational research to uncover new information about undergraduate model-based reasoning through detailed assessment of classroom learning. So the question for you, would this be an example of intellectual merit or broader impact? My answer would suggest that this is a representation of intellectual merit. So these are the things that we're going to learn from the project, the knowledge that will be gained. Here's another thing to think about. Activities planned will provide in-depth faculty development through a national series of workshops. and an expansion of an ongoing national study of the effectiveness of this approach for learning about the nature of science. Would this be an example of intellectual merit or broader impact? And I think this would be an example of broader impact because it really shows the effectiveness of the project and its impact on, for example, through a national series of workshops on developing faculty across the nation and a national study on the effectiveness of the approach. So we'll take another brief moment for questions.
So one question is, what is the appropriate scope of broader impacts? For example, is improving participation of women at our local institution sufficient, or should it be larger scale than local improvements? My answer to that would be, it depends on the nature of your project and the scope and scale of your project. And I think it's really important to convey what are the elements of your current context. So to provide information either about the population of faculty or students or others that would be engaged in your project and the potential for increasing representation in a number of respects. So I would encourage you to think of broader impacts as being fully aligned with the scope and scale of the project that you're proposing. There was a question going back to capacity building about purchasing equipment. And in that particular case, up to $130,000 of the maximum budget, $150,000, might go to the equipment purchase. And I would encourage you to think about how you can make the most effective case for being able, in the case of a capacity building proposal, to convince the reviewers that that's going to position you to put together a successful institutional and community transformation proposal in the future. If you feel like you could do that with a major equipment purchase, I would encourage you to go ahead with that, but make sure that you feel like that is in your proposal, your capacity building proposal, you would have had to make the case that you have the other elements of an ICT project in place already for that to be a successful proposal.
Here's a question about whether an increase in the number of students pursuing advanced degrees in STEM is an appropriate goal for an IUSE project. It certainly could be, and this could certainly address one of the broader impact criteria by improving a student's ability to engage in advanced academic work or move on in a STEM field. That could certainly be considered a broader impact.
Here's another question about level 1 or capacity building project. Is it okay to include summer salaries? And the answer to that is yes. When you're putting together your budget request, it's important to make sure that you've accounted for all the elements that you think, including people's time, that will be required to carry out the project and to be successful. So that can indeed include summer salaries.
Okay, another question relating to whether one is new. If you're a co-PI on an IUSE grant, does that mean you are no longer considered new to IUSE? The new to IUSE status is actually institutional based. It's not PI based. So it would be based on whether your institution has had prior IUSE funding. And so you'll need to look that up either through your sponsored programs office or through an examination of our funded awards database.
There's a question about, are different campuses of the same university considered multiple institutions or only one? NSF awards go to an institution, an individual institution. And so if the award is going to a system, that might be a single award. So that might be a nuanced point that I would encourage you to discuss with a program officer. In general, if there are multiple campuses, to tell you the truth, I've seen awards go in either direction, so that there are collaborative projects amongst institutions in a single system, or an award goes to a system, and that's a single award.
Okay, I think we're going to move on briefly. We wanted to provide you with a list of resources that might be helpful to you as you're thinking about putting together a proposal like this. There are a number of resources directly available through the National Science Foundation, and that includes our program webpage and our program solicitation. One thing that I would urge all of you to do before you prepare a proposal is to very carefully read the program solicitation. This is the Bible of information about the IUSE program. So everything you need to know about this program is in that program solicitation. It defines very clearly the criteria that are needed for projects that would fit within the IUSE portfolio, and again provides you with a good source of information about the different levels and tracks and what the expectations are for these levels. So it's a very good idea to start by reading that program solicitation before you begin putting together a program. You can also search through previously funded awards at our award search database. And if you have questions relating to a specific project that you are thinking about, you might be interested in contacting a program officer whose names and contact information are available on the program webpage.
There was a section on our prior webinar that was focused on institutional and community transformation that focused on award search strategies and the interfaces you might use to engage in that activity. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that as well if you have questions about searching for awards.
I also wanted to get back to the program officer contact. If you are preparing to speak to a program officer, it would be very helpful if you draft a 1 to 2 page outline of the ideas that you have for a potential project and send that to the program officer that you would like to speak with. This gives them a basis for understanding, what your project might entail, and if they're not the appropriate person to speak to you regarding that project, it certainly allows them to direct your query to the right person within our agency.
And those 1 to 2 page summaries typically include a very high-level description of your project, a very high-level description of how you're making your case for intellectual merit, and lastly, about broader impacts.
There are also a number of resources that are available to you. The NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide is the directive on how to physically prepare the application. What are the necessary components for a proposal? How does one submit the proposal? And what happens to it once it's received through the NSF? There is a document that was recently prepared through the National Science Foundation looking at common guidelines for education, research, and development to help those who are new to this area understand exactly what the components of educational research are. And so the link for that is also produced on this slide. There are some resources on the merit review process on the NSF webpage, including a video on the art and science of reviewing proposals that can be very helpful for those to understand what the reviewers would be looking for in your proposal as they start to go through it. And we'd also like to point you in the direction of another solicitation from a companion program, which is the Building Capacity in STEM Education Research, or BICSR solicitation.
That's the program that I talked about briefly in comparing ways that NSF programs is using the phrase building capacity or capacity building. I'd also add that the top reference, the URL on this page, is to what you may have heard referred to in other contexts, and I certainly did in this webinar, as the PAPPG. So that's where the acronym comes from, Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. And that's where you can find detailed and specific guidelines for your proposal for things like funding food.
Okay, at this point, we'd like to offer those of you who have prepared proposals before an opportunity to escape from this webinar. We would encourage you before you leave the web page itself, the Workcast web page, that you please go to the resources section and complete the event survey. The rest of the webinar is going to focus specifically on institutions that are new to NSF and what the physical components of a proposal are. So if you've prepared and submitted proposals before, you probably don't need this information, although you're certainly welcome to stay if you would like to. Okay, so the question for you is, are you or your institution new to NSF? So this section will cover the nuts and bolts of NSF proposals, including a very brief description of the different proposal components, some ideas for what might make a compelling proposal, how one submits a proposal, and what happens to that proposal once it disappears into the black box of the National Science Foundation. The proposal itself is composed of a number of distinct and different pieces. There's a cover page which provides information about the institution and the PIs and the co-PIs. This is also the page in which you indicate which level and which track you are applying for. There's a drop-down menu that has a list of all of those different options, and it's up to you to select the correct option to make sure that your proposal is directed to the right part of the IUSE program. Proposals will contain a table of contents, which is populated for you, and then you will write both a project summary and a project description. These really are the critical pieces of a proposal. The project summary is a one-page description of your project and has to include sections on intellectual merit and broader impacts. Typically, it's arranged, as Andrea mentioned very briefly, a high-level overview of your project, being as specific as you possibly can, with a short statement on intellectual merit and a short statement on broader impacts. The project description is your 15-page area to expand on your overview of your project, to provide the actual description of what you will do, to provide the plan, to provide a description of the project team, to provide your literature background, to provide all of the information that a reviewer would need to assess the validity of your particular project and its ability to be completed. The limit is 15 pages. We do not allow appendices. We do not allow additional material to be provided that might supersede this page limit. Everything that a reviewer would need to assess your project should be contained within that 15 pages. That includes all figures, tables, and everything else. The other thing you should not include in the project description are URL links to different parts of your institutional web page, for example. These links will not be live, and they're actually not required for reviewers to use those links to go in and find out the information that you're trying to lead them to. Everything should be contained within that 15 pages. You then have a section to provide the references cited, the biographical sketches for the PI, the co-PI, and the senior personnel on the project, a budget and a budget justification, which are forms that you would fill out and populate with both the numbers and with the reasons for wanting the particular numbers in those orders. We ask that you provide a listing of current and pending support for project personnel, so we know what other funding you're getting from other sources. We ask that you describe the facilities, equipment, and other resources available to you at your institution, and any additional special information and supplementary documentation as required by the project. We also ask that you include a data management plan, a postdoctoral mentoring plan if you include postdocs within your project, and single copy documents, which include things like the collaborators and other affiliations information that allows us to try to make determinations about reviewers that might be appropriate for your project that would not have a conflict of interest with you or your institution. As I mentioned, the project summary is a one-page overview of the project, and so this should include a description of the project itself. And again, I can't urge upon you cannot underestimate the importance of including very concrete description of what your project is. This is a place to tell us what you're doing to make sure that your project is actually going to be reviewed by the appropriate sets of eyes. This is the place to be really very detailed about your project without exceeding your one-page limit, to let us know exactly what the project is, the approaches it might use, the types of things it's interested in addressing, as well as brief statements about the intellectual merit and the broader impacts of the activities that you propose. It would be very helpful if you would label your statements on intellectual merit and on broader impacts, just to make sure that those are well delineated within the project summary. The project description, again, your 15-page, this is the meat and bones of your particular project, must contain within it sections labeled intellectual merit and broader impacts. This project description should provide a very clear statement of the work that you will be undertaking in the proposed project, and it should include the objectives for the period of the proposed work and the significance of those objectives. You should also indicate the relationship of the proposed work to the present state of knowledge, and again, this would be your literature review, as well as to any work that's in progress by the PI under other support mechanisms. The project description should outline the general plan of work, including a very broad description of the activities to be undertaken, and where appropriate, description of experimental methods and procedures. If you're collecting data from certain populations of students, how you might do that, how you're going to collect the data, how you'll assess the data, all of that information should be within the project description. This description really should address what you want to do, why you want to do it, how you plan to do it, how you will know if you succeed, and what benefits could accrue if the project is successful. Project activities can be based on either previously established methodologies, perhaps if you're adapting them to a new environment, or could be innovative methods and approaches, but in either case must be very well justified. This applies both to the technical aspects of the proposal and the way in which the project may make broader contributions. The project description must also contain a section labeled Broader Impacts, and this should provide a discussion of the broader impacts of the proposed activities and how they will be achieved and obtained throughout the project. Broader impacts may be accomplished through the research itself, through activities that are directly related to the specific research projects, or through activities that are supported by but complementary to the project. And broader impacts is often something in STEM education types of projects that can be a little bit hard to disentangle from intellectual merit, although you should make the best faith effort that you possibly can to tease out those two different components of your project. Brevity and clarity will assist reviewers and foundation staff in dealing effectively with your proposals. You may not exceed your 15 pages for the project description, and that includes a section on results from prior NSF support, should you have that type of support, and that would be limited to no more than 5 pages of the overall project description. The project description, as I mentioned, includes all of the visual materials, including charts, graphs, maps, photographs, and any other representations that are needed to present your project within the 15-page limitation. Again, must be self-contained, and you may not use URLs. And you also cannot use appendix material to supersede this particular page limitation.
We've talked about evaluation and assessment a few times in this webinar. It is important to address evaluation and assessment activities in your 15-page project description. You may have an external evaluator that you're working with. Those kinds of activities may be engaged in as well through an advisory board. It just depends on the nature of your project. One way to differentiate formative and summative evaluation and assessment activities is if formative is when the chef tastes the soup as opposed to when the guest tastes the soup. That is, formative assessment is intended to enable you to refine and make decisions throughout the course of your project. Summative evaluation and assessment activities are intended to help you get a sense of whether or not the project has been successful by the measures you've identified in your proposal. So what makes a proposal competitive? It's important to identify original ideas, to be succinct, as Ellen said earlier, and focused on the project plan, to be realistic about the amount of work that you propose to undertake, to have sufficient detail provided so that reviewers can understand and be confident in at the level of which you've articulated the project. It should be cost effective, have the potential to be high impact. Knowledge and experience of the PIs are very important and are often signaled both in terms of the materials covered in the project narrative, but also in the biosketches that you submit. Does the project represent a contribution to the field? Is there a clear rationale and evidence of potential efficacy? What is the likelihood of the project that it would be sustained afterwards? And has the narrative addressed sustainability in a credible way? Is there objective feedback, solid evaluation plan, either through an advisory board or through other mechanisms? In order to prepare a competitive proposal, it's of course critical to start with a good idea, to communicate clearly. It may be really important, as we'll talk about in a second, to identify a critical friend, someone who's not involved in your project but might be able to give you a clear sense of whether or not your proposal is laying out the project and your ideas in the way you intend in a cogent manner for reviewers to understand. To address the two merit review criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts. To state research objectives and questions as well as plans for evaluation. To have plans for carrying out the proposed work that are sufficiently detailed, again, so that reviewers will have a high degree of confidence in the project that you're proposing to undertake. To ground the project in relevant and appropriate literature, sometimes outside of STEM education. To get appropriate expertise on board, and to ask colleagues, again, in and out of your field, to read and critique your proposal. Furthermore, it's important to include strong arguments for the importance of the problem. To make sure that the STEM component is clearly articulated, include examples. We have had proposals that don't mention STEM at all. So that speaks to the importance of, one, going back to the solicitation, as Ellen suggested, but really think about your audience and think about how your proposal would be perceived by people who aren't a part of your project team. Make sure that the research design and methodology are appropriately and sufficiently discussed. Have a sensible chain of reasoning, links between the literature review, the process for development, the research questions, data, and the forms of analyses that you propose to use, and that the impacts of the research and development be addressed in your proposal. Tips for success. Start early. We mean that. Read the proposed program solicitation, as Ellen said. Consult the PAPPG for detailed and specific questions. Test drive Fastlane. I can't emphasize this enough. Often at a deadline, we'll get requests from people that have run into problems, either setting up profiles or accounts within Fastlane. It's really important that you submit your proposals, to enter it into Fastlane or research.gov ahead of the deadline so that you can avoid any issues that may arise or fully address them. Alert your sponsored research office. Follow the page and font size limits. Be aware of other projects and advances in the field and address those in your proposal. Cite the relevant literature and provide details. Discuss prior results if you have them, that is, with respect to prior NSF-funded work of your own or the results of prior work that are relevant to the project that others have engaged in, and include an evaluation plan with timelines and specific benchmarks. Furthermore, put yourself in the reviewer's place. Again, think about a third party who's not in your project team but is a trusted colleague to review the materials that you're putting together. Consider reviewers' comments if you're resubmitting a proposal and adopt those that you think align with your project. You will be the best judge of those and how to respond to them. Have someone, I've said this 4 times now, I think have someone else read the proposal. That's very important. Of course, spell check and grammar check. Meet deadlines. Follow NSF requirements for proposals involving human subjects. And of course, call or email NSF program officers for guidance as needed. In the solicitation, you will see, of course, the contact information for Ellen and myself, but we also have a series of other program officers that are involved in the IUSE program that have disciplinary affinities that are identified. So if you are thinking about a proposal, for example, in engineering, I would encourage you to identify program officers with an engineering affiliation or mathematics or other fields of your choosing. Proposals must be submitted electronically through Fastlane or research.gov. Grants.gov, forgive me. Submission through Fastlane is highly recommended. There are some automated checks in place in Fastlane that are not in place for research.gov. Things like pagination, font size, and things along those lines. If you submit through Fastlane, you can be alerted early on to issues that may crop up. So we encourage you to use Fastlane if you're able to do that, as opposed to grants.gov.
So the proposal, once you have mailed it or sent it in or submitted it via Fastlane, basically disappears into a large black box. That black box is NSF. So this slide is meant to help you understand what happens to the proposal once we receive it on our end. Phase 1 is actually the part that you're doing. So we announce our opportunities at least 90 days before any published deadline. The program solicitation, NSF 19-601, was actually released last September, 3 months before our December deadline, and it will be in effect for at least another couple of years. You then have a fair amount of time to prepare a proposal and submit it to the relevant deadlines. The next impending deadline is the Level 1 capacity building deadline on February 4th, 2020, so a little less than a month from now. If you miss that deadline and still would like to prepare a Level 1 or capacity building proposal, you do have another chance. You would submit it for August 4th, 2020. The proposals are then received by NSF. We look at our pool of proposals and we select reviewers for them. We issue the proposals for peer review. The proposals are reviewed typically by a panel of reviewers. We take the recommendations that are made by the panels and we consult with individuals within our own group, and we determine which proposals we would like to move forward for an award. The division director of our division reviews those recommendations and approves them, hopefully. And then once an award is recommended, there's some additional processing time that is needed to actually set up and issue the award. From submission to review, the completion of review is about 6 months, and if an award is recommended, it's usually an additional 30 days or so.
We're about at our time for the webinar.
So I think we're going to skip the questions for the moment and say thank you very much for your interest in improving undergraduate STEM education. And just to remind you that this webinar will be archived on the AAAS website, and you'll have access to it as well as to the slides that we presented today. Thanks very much for listening, and we hope you'll send us all your good ideas.